All right. Well, welcome to the Family Office Insider Podcast. My name is Jason Nagel, and today I'm going to be talking to you about estate planning with the family cabin and keeping it within the family. There's many families that have cabins or cottages that they go to throughout the year, and being that it's April now, the weather's starting to get quite nice. People are starting to think about heading back out to the cottage, opening it up for the season, and getting out there and enjoying it with their family. If you're a parent that owns a cabin and you would like to keep it within your family, there's a few things that we're going to talk about in this podcast that will hopefully help you create an agreement with your children so that it'll pass down effectively to them and avoid frustration and fights with all the family members. The very first thing that we recommend is getting an agreement in place. Before you pass away, making sure that you sit down with a lawyer and your kids and walking through and understanding what are all the provisions that this co-ownership agreement should have within it, and making sure that you get buy-in from your children. If there's some ideas or some provisions that you think are important, making sure that you understand those, explain them to your kids, have them share their views on it, and make sure that everybody's working together to get this agreement in place. That's how you're going to have the most effective transition of this family cottage down to your kids, for sure. So within this agreement, what are some things that you should have within it? Well, the very first thing that we're going to talk about is a trust that would have some funds within it that would be left from the parents. So they're in the will, the parents would leave some funds in a trust account to fund the cabin expenses. And so the co-ownership agreement should talk about that trust fund. And I think that's important because if you left a couple $100,000, for example, behind to fund these trust expenses, that's going to be very helpful to replace the roof or replace windows and doors, or perhaps there's a dock that needs to be replaced or a deck. All of these things can be extremely expensive, and it really depends on your children, their stages of life, where they're at with their careers, their children, etc., as to whether they're going to have the funds for those types of expenses or not. So you can imagine that if you've got two children and one is doing really well financially, and maybe they've got the cash to spend $20,000 on a deck, but the other one, perhaps maybe they don't. Or maybe one family member is, maybe both are capable of spending that much money on these expenses. However, one lives in the city and actually uses the cabin quite a bit, where the other one maybe lives in the US and doesn't use it. So they might be not as inclined to spend their money to fix the cabin when they feel that they don't use it. That's where having a trust fund to fund the cabin expenses can be extremely important. So the next thing that I would recommend is creating a usage schedule. So understanding who gets to use the cabin and when. What does that look like? How is that defined? And I think talking with your children and understanding what they would like and how they see it playing out would be very helpful with the usage schedule as well. Another provision that I think would be important on there is the responsibilities around the cabin. So what happens when you're using it? So you have to make sure that you clean it up before you leave so that when someone comes that it's nice and clean. Perhaps you restock all the fridge with all the little necessary things that are important that everybody gets to use. And also just making sure that you understand who's responsible to open the cabin up in the springtime and shut it down in the fall. That's important because it's a lot of work to open up a cabin and to get it all ready for the season, but it's also a lot of work to shut it down. And so making sure that there's a rotation schedule there. And if someone is not around or someone opts not to do it or they're just not capable of doing it for whatever reason, well, then how does that work? What's the protocol? Do you hire someone to come in? And if you do, who's in charge of those expenses? Another thing is to plan for the unexpected. So what happens if a child can't afford to make their payments towards the electrical bills, for example, or the land taxes or the insurance? Because remember, the trust fund, in my opinion, should be to fund the cabin expenses. However, if their expenses being like fixing the roof, fixing the doors, fixing whatever, but the ongoing expenses such as land taxes, insurance, etc., should be funded from the children's cash flow. But what happens if there's a child that can't afford that? Maybe the trust fund then is going to be enhanced a little bit to account for that. Or what happens if a child wants out because they'd rather have their money. They don't want to be tied into this cabin. What does that look like? If they were to pass away. So let's say that, you've got two children and, you leave the cabin behind for the two of them, and one of them unfortunately passes away and they have kids of their own. What does that look like? Do their kids still get access to the cabin? Are they bought out? If so, what's the fair market value of that? So it really is kind of like a business. If you think about it, with a business, you have a shareholders agreement that's going to govern all the shareholders. And with a cabin, you have a co-ownership agreement that governs all the co-owners of the cabin. So getting the parents to do this while alive is going to be extremely important. And also don't forget the tax implications. So when you pass a cabin down to family members, You're going to have a capital gain almost certainly on that cabin. And so how is that going to be funded? So making sure that you understand that, number one, what is the extent of that capital gain? Is there ways to mitigate it, perhaps by using your own principal residence exemption on the cabin rather than on the home that you regularly live in? And understanding what assets do you have that will fund that tax liability? And is there some other ways that you could possibly fund that tax liability? Insurance planning could be one of those ways, or perhaps maybe you sell your principal residence and that's where you get the cash to fund the tax on the cabin. So there's many, many different types of planning opportunities that you can look at there. So I hope that you found this helpful. The idea today was just to talk to you about some planning things you might want to consider if you in fact do own a family cabin that you want to pass down to your children. If you found this to be helpful, feel free to follow us. Check us out on our website at 360wealth.ca and connect with us if you want to learn a little bit more about what we do. Okay, thank you. You take care.